Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Would someone move item 1.02 to approve the agenda?
Move. Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, and abstentions. Pass 600. I need to share with everyone our evacuation procedure. We have doors at either end of this room. I ask that you go to either door and please move out and away from the building in an orderly fashion. Would you now join the board in the pledge to our flag? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This brings us to the public forum portion of our meeting, and we have a guest speaker this evening, Reverend Ruth Warner.
I was hoping somebody was talking before me so I know what the procedure is, but here we go.
Here you go. We're good.
Hi and good evening to everyone. Like she said, my name is Ruth Rosa Warner. I am the new pastor at the Fulton First United Methodist Church, and I began ministry there in July, the 1st of July, and had been trying to figure out a way to reach out and introduce myself, but it's been busy and many things timing-wise didn't work out. But I believe that God's timing is perfect, so here I am today, just reaching out to say that the church and I, the church members and I are definitely desiring to collaborate with you in any way that we can. We are starting a youth group every other Sunday evening. The first gathering was the 15th, and this coming Sunday we're getting together again. And we're, hoping to extend our love and welcome other friends from the community and also serve in any way. And lastly, I wanted to share that I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, entonces yo hablo español. If I am able to help in any way that you need me, I'm simply a phone call away and a walk across the street. So do know that I'm at your service. I'm more than a pastor. I want to be your friend. I want to collaborate with you any way that I can. So I have some cards here with me. I'll leave them with these two beloved people that I just met, and know that I'm at your service. God bless you and good night.
Reverend, thank you for coming, and I want to just ask you to share. She has another talent she didn't tell you about. She's a former teacher.
I am a former music teacher, so I play bassoon, and that's my main instrument. I play a little bit of piano, a little bit of string bass, and totally, I love to collaborate. So if you need a bassoonist for something, if you need Spanish speaking or translation, if you need somebody to do games, because I love board games too, whatever that I can help you with, please reach out. And if it's not one of my talents, I figure out a way or I get somebody else to help us, but I'm here to collaborate with you, okay? So
Thank you so much for taking the time to come introduce yourself to us. Very grateful to have you part of our community and very grateful for your offer to collaborate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for those that signed up this evening, which will take us to item 1.06 to approve the minutes from the January 10th regular meeting.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, and abstentions. Pass 600. Are there any questions with regards to any of the meetings or events under the President's report?
Just a reminder, on the 7th, that's going to be a stakeholder budget committee. So just to give clarification to board members. We're in the process of just finalizing that group. From previous members, we always start with our previous to create the consistency. So that'll be a stakeholder budget committee. And we should be starting to see our budget around that time. So this will be really to generate ideas and thoughts from community members.
Thank you. All right, so that leaves me to turning the meeting over to you, Mr. Polvino.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome to our second meeting in January. This evening we start off with restorative practices this evening. Mrs. Tiffany, our Director of Student Support Services, will be presenting this evening. She works closely with Mrs. Geithner.
Yes, good evening. So Tiffany is here, as Brian said, to share with us where we are in our implementation of restorative practices, to give you an overview of the philosophy and the foundation of that approach that we are using, and also update you on currently how implementation looks in each of our buildings and where we go from here. So I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Tiffany.
All right, thank you, Mrs. Geithner. Are you able to hear me okay? All right. So just as Mr. Palvino and Mrs. Geithner shared, I know that I've had the privilege of working with the board outside of our board meetings a little bit to facilitate a circle and start to dip our toes in the water about understanding restorative practices. But this is a nice opportunity tonight. I'm excited to share really kind of a primer of restorative practices in theory, and then more importantly, what that looks like here in Fulton City School District. I'm going to do my best to be efficient with this. I could talk about this all night long and I won't keep you, but please know that I really am a phone call or email away. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. So starting with our mission and vision, just one piece that I'd like to highlight is within our district vision, the phrasing, where all are welcomed. I know it's something that we talk about, but as we move through tonight's work of restorative practices, such a cornerstone of that is the idea of feeling welcomed, feeling a sense of belonging, developing. So it really aligns so closely with our district vision. So before we get started, I want to make sure that we're on the same page with what are restorative practices. It's a term that we hear frequently. The definition itself, as it relates to practices in schools, restorative practice, it's a process by which an individual acknowledges wrongdoing, takes steps to repair harm, and is welcomed back into the school community. So there's several steps, several components of those practices. It fosters a culture that elevates dialogue and values relationships. That's the definition by the Conflict Center, but it really does a nice job of capturing the meat of restorative practices, which is relationships, repairing relationships and making sure that we are moving forward together as a sense of community. Many people feel that restorative justice and restorative practices in schools can be a little trendy right now, can feel like a buzzword, as with a lot of what happens in education. But it is important to note that there are indigenous roots dating back centuries. Restorative justice was a way of life, a way of organizing, a way of coming to resolution when there was conflict. And again, dating back centuries. It was really brought into Western culture in the 1970s. And since, in the more recent past, it's been adapted to support school communities. As we're looking more and more at school culture and climate, making sure that students are safe, both physically and emotionally. It was also really brought into schools and highlighted most recently to address disproportionality, specifically racial disproportionality. So schools are seeing that when looking at discipline data, suspension data, if there are more students suspended, Black students, Hispanic students, often restorative practices are one strategy to use to kind of move in the right direction there. Hold on. There is an understanding, a quote that I often use when I'm doing trainings around restorative practices. The idea is the person is not the problem is the problem. And I think that's a really nice way to look at restorative practices, because so often we're addressing the person and the person goes away, but the problem doesn't. So when you think about that in terms of adults and you think about our legal system, we can equate that to incarceration, right? So a crime is committed, the adult is incarcerated. The problem still exists. The individual might be away for a while, but the problem still exists. And it's the same with our students, and it's the same with any of us as humans, that we need to step forward and lean in and work on the problem, not just separate the individual. This all falls on a continuum of practices from very proactive work to responsive work. And here's an example. I'm not going to go into all of the specifics because it would just take quite a bit of time, but there are various strategies, various practices to use that are restorative in nature. We call it creating a culture of care. So you can see from left to right, starting with restorative language. It's called effective statements. So using language in the classroom, this could be teachers, it could be our paraprofessionals, our leaders in the building, our families at home, just using statements so that we know, that others know how their behavior is impacting us. Now that can be positive, it could be in a more negative way. I could say, I'm really worried when I see you on your phone instead of doing the assignment that we're supposed to be doing. I'm not blaming Mark for being on the phone right now, but I'm saying I'm feeling worried. That behavior is having an impact on me. It's making me feel worried. So these are some quick strategies. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. It's just some shifts in our language. All the way up to, we have restorative conversations or restorative chats that are just those kind of quick hallway conversations about repairing harm. Moving all the way into the far right, formal conference. That is something that takes a lot of planning. We have various stakeholders at the table. We have family members. We have teachers, students, perhaps a friend or someone who they're in conflict with. Potentially agency involvement, if they have someone who's working with the family outside of school, they may be in attendance. Those are bigger and much more formal. So you can see this continuum. We want more of these, it says over to the left, those quick interactions that build up relationship and community over time. And the hope is that we will then have less need for these, the formal conferences, because they do take more people, more planning, more time to have those bigger, more formal conferences. All right, and another founding principle as we're just conceptualizing restorative practices, it's a quote that reads, "Human beings are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes in their behavior when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them." We've talked a lot about student voice over the past several years, and I think increasing each year, it's become more of a highlight, more of a North Star for us as a district. And that's another reason that we are finding restorative practices to be so powerful, is that this is about students leaning into the work, thinking about what they need from themselves, from each other, to resolve conflict, to keep that community, maintain that positive community, maintain emotional safety. So less conversations, kind of assigning consequences and more problem solving together. It's really collaborative work. Okay, I'm not going to read through all of these. I know this is in board backup, but I did want to highlight a few differences between punitive or kind of our more traditional way of working and a restorative mindset. The first line you can see, misbehavior is defined as. So traditionally, we think of misbehavior as breaking rules, right? A rule has been broken. We think of that as misbehaving. When you're wearing that restorative hat, it's more about the harm that is done to a person or a group. So what relationships have been impacted? Who has been impacted? Not what rule, but who, because we're in the people business. We want to make sure that our people, our students are okay, that our teachers and our staff, our community members are okay. So we need to keep them the focus more than kind of which rule, kind of identifying which rule has been broken. Another line that I would like to highlight tonight is the idea of accountability. It's a word that I know I hear often. There's often questions about, is the student being held accountable? And it's a great question. We want to make sure our students are being held accountable. That is a goal that we should continue to have. But accountability is defined differently by different people. And so often, traditionally, we think of accountability as receiving punishment. So sometimes when I hear the question, is he being held accountable or is she being held accountable? The question really is there that punitive kind of exclusionary punishment? Is there the pound of flesh? Are they paying for what they have done? When accountability in a restorative mindset is making sure that a student who has misbehaved, who has caused harm, understands the impact of their actions, is able to take responsibility, true responsibility for the choices that they've made, that they are able to be a part of the problem solving and suggest ways to repair harm, restore community, and actually take those steps. That's accountability, and that's long-lasting accountability. This is, you can see from the last line here, we're looking at the long term. We're playing for the long win. So often the traditional, more punitive ways of functioning are short term. And we want to make sure that we are really setting our students up for success for lifelong practices. this is just an example for you to see what a restorative conversation might look like. These are some questions, and they can be adapted to fit developmentally. Of course, we're not going to use the same language with a first grader as we are someone in 12th grade, but this is the idea here. And before even getting into the questions, I want you to notice that there are two columns here. The first, those are questions to respond to the person who has been harmed. Again, thinking of our traditional model, we always go towards the student who has done the harm or has misbehaved. But restorative practices also focus on the student who has been harmed, because that is just as important. So we have a set of questions. What did you think when you realized what happened? So kind of engaging them cognitively. What impact has this incident had on you, on others? What has been the hardest thing for you? And maybe most importantly, what do you think needs to happen to make things right? So again, we in positions of authority think that we should say, I know what will make things right. But really, we need to engage the person who has been harmed to say, what do you need right now to make things right? And then, of course, the questions to the student who has done the harm or misbehaved. We want to hear what happened. Again, cognitively engage them, hear their story. What were you thinking at the time? What have you been thinking about since? Making sure that they are able to identify who has been affected by what you've done. That's the whole idea of restorative, is being able to repair those relationships, identify who's been affected. And what do you need to do to make things right? And it's taking all of that together, what the students feel needs to happen. And then, of course, it's not simply on the students. We're the adults in the school, and we need to make sure that those are safe options and appropriate options. But we want to make sure that those needs are being met and that we're helping drive that work. Right. So the past several slides have been restorative practices and what that means, what it is. Very briefly, I want to address a few misconceptions that I often hear. So this is really restorative practices, what it is not. It's not counseling, it's not therapy. Sometimes we have people say, oh, we're really getting into, we don't want to push therapy within the classroom, and this is not that. This is relationship building, it's conversation, it's helping students to engage in really social emotional learning, learning how to manage their emotions and have those pro-social relationships. A soft approach to discipline. It is, I would argue, that restorative practices, when done correctly, can actually be much more difficult, potentially uncomfortable for students, for adults, for anyone engaging in the process. When you have to look someone in the eye and talk about what you have done and how it has impacted them, and have those very real conversations, that's a difficult thing to do. It's uncomfortable, and often more uncomfortable and more challenging than serving detention or serving suspension. It's not all or nothing. So often we think, oh, we're now restorative, we're not suspending. I hear people, we're not doing these things. Of course we are. There is a time and a place. We need to make sure our school is safe and that we have time to develop strong plans. We still, there are no consequences that we had in the past that we don't have anymore. There is a time and a place, but we are moving towards, in addition to that, making sure that we're having these conversations so that students are really internalizing and understanding the impact. It's not a curriculum or a program. It's not something that we pay for in a box, right? It's our staff are becoming trained to have these conversations, and they're growing with their confidence. So there's no specific program. And it is not only reactive or only responsive. If you look at the continuum, probably about 80% of this work is really proactive. It's about building relationships and creating a sense of safety, because we know that you can't repair relationships that you don't have. So a huge focus is developing relationships. All right, and the next few slides, I'm briefly going to show how this work connects to other work that we've had for many years within the district. This should look familiar. This is our social emotional learning wheel of competencies. And you can see, I'm just going to speak quickly to the colored, the orange, yellow, and green parts of the circle. And these are goals and competencies that we work towards having our students and adults develop as they grow developmentally. So these conversations, whether they're circles, whether they're brief chats, whether they're formal conferences, they work to develop students' self-awareness, and that's really understanding their own emotions and how they're feeling. Self-management, how those emotions, how they look in action, right? So I'm feeling a certain way. How am I managing that emotion? Is it coming out in a pro-social way, or is it coming out as a challenging behavior? The green is all about social awareness, relationship skills. Again, at the end of the day, this is all about relationship, and certainly responsible decision-making. It's helping students plan for next time. What's a better way to react when I'm feeling this way? How can we keep this relationship strong and move forward? So the restorative work aligns beautifully with supporting our SEL, our social emotional learning work. And also I wanted to touch on our trauma-sensitive practices. As you know, this is something that has been promoted and supported for many years here in Fulton City School District. The idea of building resiliency and how we as adults, trusted adults, can help build resiliency within the students in our Fulton community. Restorative practices dovetails nicely with this as well. Helping to empower students through engaging with a trusted adult in that problem-solving process to work together and repair harm that their behavior may have caused. It leads to greater self-awareness, a sense of connection to the community, promoting feeling recognized, heard, respected, and valued. That's all about offering voice and choice for our students. And lastly, it directly and indirectly teaches relationship and other social emotional skills. Again, these are trauma-sensitive practices and naturally come up in our restorative work. Okay. And this is just for your review, how everyone plays a role in the district. All of our staff and our leaders play a role within restorative practices. You can see at the top our classroom teachers, our school home liaisons, counselors, psychologists. They are using that restorative language, engaging in community building circles and restorative chats and restorative circles. They're invited often to help problem solve and be a part of those communities. Our social emotional learning interventionists, that's our partnership with Peaceful Schools. They provide Tier 2 interventions, but they're often using restorative practices, oftentimes using the circle process. Restorative practice specialists are really leaders in this work, and they are housed in buildings. They're supporting classroom circles. They are leading restorative chats and some of those more formal conferences. They also are our consultants and professional development providers within buildings. And certainly our leadership, our building leadership, keeping this work at the forefront. They are assigning restorative disciplinary actions. And my gratitude to district leadership who's supporting this work, both at a practical and financial level, certainly the Board of Education. All right, and a quick look at our data from last year. This is one small piece to consider. It is the work of our restorative practice specialists. This is last year, elementary, the average number of instances per building. So I'll talk you through this a little bit. How time was spent. You'll see green is really proactive work. Yellow is kind of responding to maybe some minor misbehavior, and red is more responsive to some more intense needs. So a number of instances of staff training, coaching, and consultation. We want to make sure that it's not just our restorative specialists implementing this work. They're leading it in buildings, but we want teachers, we want all staff to be able to feel comfortable having the conversations with students. Community building circles to help build community and relationships within classrooms. 381 was the average. You can see here restorative chats and Tier 2 intervention. And then moving into the red are those formal conferences. So those are the ones that are a little bit more time-consuming, a little bit more intensive. They can include the prep and follow-up and family communication as well. Could be something like a reentry meeting after a suspension, for example. And time spent de-escalating students in the moment. They also have other tasks, collaboration, professional development, data collection, things like that. But one note that I'd like to make about this slide is that I was very happy to see that there were more instances in the green and less as we move down to the red. Exactly like that continuum that I showed you on one of the first slides. We want more of that proactive work so that we have to do less of the reactive or responsive work. All right, and I was supposed to have a couple friends with me tonight, and unfortunately they weren't able to make it. The restorative practice specialists, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge them and thank them publicly for really leading this work within their buildings. They have done a fantastic job with some new endeavors and new language that they're using. They're really rocking it. And so they wanted to come share a couple of examples, and I'm hoping that at a future meeting, we'll be able to hear more from them. And just some resources that we're utilizing with our professional development and training within the district. There's a lot out there. Just wanted to note the very top one, RJ Education, Restorative Justice Education. I have been trained through that organization and been able to turnkey, and we've used a lot of great materials, so again, thank you to that organization. All right. Any questions? I know it's a lot in a kind of condensed time.
I think I just have one question. So as someone, a practitioner working in the field, support restorative practices, but how do we make sure that everyone in our community knows that it doesn't mean there aren't consequences at times? Because I think that's one of the things that some might miss, you know what I mean? Certainly in the presentation, we want to be supportive of the development of our students and their growth in developing those skills, but there are times when there are natural consequences to life, and so how do we reconcile that for our staff and our students?
Absolutely. I think one thing, one change in my language is I have, instead of saying restorative practices and consequences, I've tried to talk about, restorative practices, there are consequences. Some of those are the consequence, and really calling things by name. So, maybe you're talking about suspension right now. Right? And so I think having that conversation with people about, yes, absolutely, there are times for suspension. We want to make sure that our students are safe, and I would say looking at our data, we are certainly not eliminating suspensions or some of those more exclusionary practices. We know there's a time and a place, and we're seeing that, it's not going away.
And I think it's one of the tricky things with the slide that talks about traditional versus restorative.
Yes.
I mean, you need that slide.
Right. Yeah,
But
to
at the same
understand, but really
time-
it should be an
Right.
and, right? Some of that is traditional
Right.
and restorative.
Right.
I looked at it a little different, not and, but part of. I see it as a whole. It's part of our overall approach to teaching self-awareness and self-discipline in our discipline and behavior model
Absolutely.
for everyone. But to go to David's point, internally, I struggle still with a number of our support staff that don't understand what it is. And I know from experience that everyone that works here in the system takes messages out into the community. So if they don't understand it well, we're not communicating well to the community what we do. So I'm just wondering if there's strategies to help better communicate to everyone within so that we can do a better job communicating outside.
Absolutely. And I would agree that there are various levels of understanding right now. This is still pretty new to everyone here. And so we are constantly going back to the drawing board in terms of how that communication is not just a one and done, but how we're making sure that that is happening, that there's a common understanding. in all buildings. And another part of our problem solving is how do we get this out to the community? We've had some, lunch and learns and Parent University and some newsletters home, but those are just tidbits. So, there might be a couple people watching tonight, but again, there's just a few. We really need that to be global. And so that's something that we are talking about, and certainly open to suggestions with that.
And one last observation is that our traditional model wasn't working for everyone. We weren't getting behavior change that we needed for those people involved. We weren't helping them, and we weren't helping our overall environment of our buildings. I believe that we're seeing some improvement in the environment in our buildings. I could be wrong because I'm basing it on a lot of anecdotal information. But I do think it seems the environments overall seem better, but we still have young people making some bad choices. And we still deal with those. So again, how do we communicate to folks that there's an improvement in the overall culture of our school, but we still have young people with issues that sometimes cause them to make bad choices.
And I will say, too, that one of the strategies that Liz and the restorative practices specialists have talked about, and we have integrated into our professional development, is that you have to experience this sometimes in order to understand how it works. So our restorative practice specialists have been pretty deliberate about involving our paraprofessionals. I think that's who you mean when you say support staff. Our paraprofessionals in those restorative conferences. So if something happens while one of our aides or monitors is supervising recess or in the cafeteria, in order to restore that harm, they have to be part of that dialogue. And a lot of that is building capacity and structures within our system for the time. But the human resources piece of that, getting the right people in the right place for the right amount of time to do that. And Liz and the team has been working really diligently to be creative about coming up with solutions to that. I think that it is an area of development for us. On our February 3rd Professional Development Day, we are including our paraprofessionals in our staff development days for the first time really this year consistently, and that will be one of the topics that they will be exploring in the afternoon on February 3rd. So we're going to keep chipping away at it to try to build that understanding.
Well, that's excellent news, and I should have known that you were already on top of it, but it's always good to ask.
Thank you.
Outstanding.
I have just a question too. I love that. I really truly believe that in order to make change, you have to build from the bottom up. So the elementary starting and seeing data from the elementary is great. And we're building from the bottom up, and we are educating our students to better express themselves and use words and not all the time actions. I get that. I guess I'm curious to see data from the middle school and the high school also, because I know that it's a different mindset. And if we're seeing any less behaviors in the high school and in the middle school, as we focus on less punitive and more restorative, like how they are responding to that? Are we seeing less fights? Are we seeing less less cell phone use? Are we seeing more cooperative behaviors in having conversations? Because I know that as you get older, actions speak louder than words. I can tell you, yes, I understand, but then I go out and I do something else. So I guess I definitely see the value in this, but I would also, I guess I'm just curious to see maybe some data from the middle school and the high school. And I hope that all of our kids, especially the older kids, as we build relationships, and if you are affected by something, an action that happens in school, that they feel safe also, is my concern, because I'm unsure how that works here at the older levels.
Thank you. And I'm just going to briefly respond because I don't have the data in front of me, but I can share a few things. The junior high data for the restorative specialist was not included simply because we had a gap. We had someone who was working with us for the first few months, and then she ended up moving to Vermont. And so we had a gap of several months. So it just would skew the data for the purpose of this presentation. I certainly can get that to the board for this year, for the first part of this year, if that would be beneficial. And in terms of our behavior data, again, I don't want to quote specific numbers, but I can tell you that when you simply look at number of referrals in comparison to previous years, you do see a little bit fewer referrals, but I think what's more important is when you drill down and look at the types of referrals, the actual behaviors or actions, we are seeing things like skipping at a pretty high rate still, but we are seeing less of that, the relationship, like non-compliance has gone down. So those, the power struggles with the teachers and the relationships that students are having with teachers, we are seeing those behaviors at a lesser rate, which I think is exciting. Certainly we need to address things like skipping, but the more relational behaviors, if that makes sense, we are seeing at a lesser rate. So I can't quote the numbers tonight, but I
Yeah.
certainly can get that for you.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
I also want to point out, we do not have a restorative practice specialist at the high school level. So there are dedicated individuals at all 4 elementary schools and one at the junior high school, but we did not plan for a restorative practice specialist here at the high school, and that is something that we're talking about as we move forward with our resource evaluation, where we need to allocate those resources. We did have a social emotional learning specialist here to work on the Tier 1 curriculum, but we didn't go as far as including a restorative practice specialist at that next Tier 2 and Tier 3. So something that is under review for us.
So when we're talking about discipline, like at the high school level, are we focusing, are our teachers focusing on a more restorative style without the restorative specialists being there? I know that we're doing social emotional learning. You don't call it when you guided study hall, through the guided study hall. So I guess, are we in the discipline, are we using more of a restorative practice approach, or are we sort of in a in-betweener type of thing?
We actually started, in terms of staff training, we have gone back 3+ years now with our high school. Our high school folks were the first to really have ongoing training. We'd have weekly collaboration time with them, and we'd have many kind of PD, 20, 30-minute PD opportunities. They were the first to have that ongoing training. So I'd say that with the exception of maybe some of our newest staff, they probably are the most trained at this time.
So there's a lot of the embedding of the language and the community building portions of the practice, right? The circles, the community building circles, the restorative chats, those are happening because we have a framework for the language, but we don't have an individual here who's specifically dedicated to the more intensive.
And maybe that's why the number of referrals are fewer, because we're using a different approach. Am I on the right track here? Like, if we look at the data, we would have less referrals at the high school, but would behaviors be changing? Because we would not go right to writing a referral, we would go into more of a conversation or a relationship. Do you know what
I like to hope I'm not sure. We have to consider the root cause, but that's the hope, certainly.
Miss Tiffany?
Yes.
I had a question. I mean, I have a million questions, but I want to keep the meeting not too long. When you mentioned that there's not formal teaching of the restorative practices, like as far as lessons or whatever, is it taught maybe in conjunction with SEL, or is it really just something as the cases arise, they're introduced to the theory itself? We talked about how it's important that a kindergartner can understand it, but they have to understand it at a kindergartner level versus a 12th grader can understand it at a 12th grader level. But I didn't know if we're formally introducing this, or if it's more of when they need to be introduced to it is when they're first getting introduced.
Yes, great question. It is not something that is explicitly taught in that we are not expecting our students to know that restorative practices are happening necessarily. It is a way that the adults in the school are helping to create that culture of care, the culture of problem solving and student voice. We want students to feel the impact of that, but they don't necessarily need to know why teachers are asking them those questions or the language that teachers are using. This is really about teaching adults and the student experience.
I guess a follow-up with that as well is we talked about with the students and kind of a leading by example approach. Is there anything involved right now with, say, colleague to colleagues implementing this approach as well, or is it mainly focusing on whether it's, you know, teacher to student, student to student, student to family, et cetera?
No, we recognize that the collegial relationships are paramount, and so we have principals leading faculty meetings with some of this work. We have, when there is some conflict that arises, I've been part of facilitating conversations with, you know, some teams of teachers or departments, things like that, to really, it's twofold. It's to help those relationships and help everyone move forward, but it's also helping them to experience what our students are experiencing. So the collegial relationships are huge.
Well, I think that's it. You know, I'll have to talk to you at a different point because I'm very interested in this stuff, but
Absolutely.
I'll hold it there.
Thanks, Tim.
I love the dialogue tonight because I like the idea of the restorative practice. I do see some positives going forward in the district. However, I am still hearing from some of your school community, and maybe it's just that the more training, or they're just not, maybe they're just having a rough class, they're not seeing that restorative side actually working, that accountability part. But I am hearing it from different buildings and from parents that, and maybe it is they just don't understand completely. They're not feeling the accountability for their kids, and not saying that they want the punitive part. They don't want to see their kids out of school. They don't want to see that kind of thing. But the disruption in the class is still real. It's still very real. And so if the kids are coming back with their restorative practice in the haha, I'm not in trouble phase mode, I can see where some of your school community is getting frustrated with this. I really liked that you're opening up to the paraprofessionals, and your PD day is really engaging for them, because so very often for paraprofessionals, they're just like, there's nothing for me. This is perfect for them. I like that, so I'm very glad that you're doing that. But what do we do for our school community, the people that are working for you, the parents who are really trying to understand this? Because some of them are not feeling that this is working. I think that they're giving it a shot, but they don't feel it's working. And off of that as well, the circle time, you were going to bring back some data at some point. I remember we talked a while back. Do we feel it's working for our students? Are we seeing a difference? How often are we using it in our classrooms?
So it's not up there anymore, but the data that was shown tonight, I believe that there was a circle. Can you pull it back up? Oh, you know what? I have it right in front of me. I'm sorry. Again, that is, yes. So the community building circles, if you go, it's right towards the end. So again, this is last year's data. So if you look at the second, this is just our restorative specialists. Average across the buildings were 381 instances of facilitating those circles. In addition to that, our teachers, the goal was that over time, there was a little bit less hand-holding, and teachers were running those on their own.
And are they running them on their own, and do they feel that they're working for their students?
So we had a survey at the end of last year. We will be sending one out again this year to see the difference. Those who responded, you know, to your point, I think the understanding, it seemed that there was kind of a direct correlation between understanding of these practices and then confidence in implementation and seeing results. Like, there was a direct correlation there. Those that still felt that they did not fully understand were less confident implementing and therefore not seeing the results as much. So we certainly need to get that back out this year. But I will say that our restorative specialists are doing a lot more of that coaching and consultation. And I would say anecdotally that we're seeing an increase in confidence and therefore an increase in implementation.
So just want to add, I also want to add that the idea of a student coming back and saying, I wasn't in trouble. When harm happens within the classroom community, that whole classroom community, it's not like something that happens to the student outside of the classroom community, or someone does something to the student outside of the classroom community. There may be an individualized restorative conference that happens with that child, their family, an administrator, a teacher, a paraprofessional, but a lot of this work has to do with building the classroom community. So there needs to be additional conversation. And again, I think we're at different levels of implementation. In a perfect implementation, that conversation happens with the whole class. So the class has the opportunity to say, my learning was disrupted. I didn't like it when I felt this way in my classroom. And again, ideally, that's where we want to be. And in some places,
And we are
that's
seeing
where we
that in
are.
pockets, yes.
And in some places, that's where we are. And so we need to just keep replicating those effective practices and helping people understand the value of the community building piece of this. It also takes time.
Yeah.
And so that's something that, our instructional staff in particular, we need to have them feel comfortable that they can, and we support them in investing the time to do that.
And so when you answered Tim's question about, wait, I forgot where I was going with this. Hold on. About how it's not implemented for your students learning it, it's more about the adults. So it's not like they kind of know what the restorative is, but if they're coming back from the class and they don't realize, is this part of why maybe they don't realize that they're not in trouble? Because we don't want that, I understand that we don't want that punitive part, I get that, but is it making it a difference for classroom learning, like you said? Because students are thinking my learning was disruptive, but that student coming back in is still disrupting class.
I think the notion that we try to communicate to families and to staff and to students is the idea of discipline. The word discipline means to teach. And so when we talk about discipline, we really want to take those opportunities to teach. And I think, as Mrs. Geithner was saying, sometimes that starts outside of the room, but when they come back, everyone is aware that there is some sort of teaching or acknowledgement taking place because they're a part of it. So for example, the students who had that disrupted learning are a part of the discussion. They're talking about how they were impacted. They talk about strategies for students moving forward. So they know that that student is being acknowledged because they're part of the conversation. Even our second graders, our little ones, are part of that conversation at a developmentally appropriate level. I don't know if that's answering your question. I feel like I'm not quite.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I'm just kind of hoping, like you said, this is new and it's working itself out. But I'm just hoping that over time, and hopefully not, in the near future time, that our students are getting it and understanding on both ends. Whether it's they're coming back and have to do, I'm going to use apologize, but that's not really the word that you're going for, or if it's the students who are disrupted, who are, letting them know their feelings. Just the tools for the teachers to help them and to make them feel like it's working on both ends, students and staff.
And the other thing that I think it's important to note is for a student who might have chronic infractions of our code of conduct, right? Restorative practices are part of a plan, but they are not the only thing that is in place to support those students. So, or help to foster a change in behavior. So if one particular student is chronically disrupting a class, restorative practices are part of our approach, but there are also a lot of other things that are being put in place to support that student, making better choices, developing more appropriate skills. It is not a standalone approach. It is part of a comprehensive system.
And that could be what some of the people or even parents are thinking, that this is standalone. But I like that you're working and you're making a plan as a whole. So thank you.
And thank you for the feedback. It's very helpful for us moving forward.
And I guess one last question from me, Ms. Tiffany, that I always like to ask is, how can we help you and provide more resources that you can see areas that if we were able to implement more, we could see a maybe smoother, quicker transition, et cetera? Because these things do take time no matter what you're putting into them to build, but just what could you use more of, or how could we help you?
Oh, I like it. Magic wand question. Oh, that's tough. I appreciate that. I do think that, to everyone's point, the professional development, the time with our staff to deepen their understanding and provide them with more of those experiences is really what we need most right now, honestly. Mrs. Geithner, is there anything that you can think of off the top of your head?
I agree with Liz that continued investment in professional development, teacher and staff capacity building around this, but also some more opportunities to engage with our families and communities, community members to help promote understanding of these practices. And I think that as we look at and evaluate our student support systems globally, looking at it from a comprehensive practice approach. So I guess to simplify that, we added social emotional learning interventions, for example, because when we analyzed how our system was working, we recognized we didn't have the staff capacity or the time or the dedicated personnel to do tier 2 group interventions and explicit teaching of social skills in small group. So we added that in there, and I think that that is part of the ongoing dialogue that Liz leads as the Director of Student Support with each of the teams who are doing this work. And we use tools like a tiered fidelity inventory to check our systems and practices, and we can get back to the board with more specific recommendations as part of the budget and staffing process moving forward.
Thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tiffany. Alrighty, our next item this evening is our monthly operations and finance report for December, as well as a federal funds update. Dr. Lisi and your team?
Thank you, Mr. Provino. I've asked Ms. DiBiase to provide the financial update and the federal stimulus report for us this evening.
All right, can everybody hear me? Thank you for having me here tonight. The first thing that I wanted to talk about for our expenditures and our revenues for this year. So as of December 31st, compared to the prior year, we're pretty much on par percentage-wise. And the reason I want to highlight the percentage-wise of what we've spent is that we did receive a large increase in our state aid. So rather than looking at the dollar values, I think the percentage is a better accurate measure of how consistent we are year to year. Our expenditures are up a little bit. Some of that is because, you know, we are trying to make our purchasing more year-round rather than doing it in bursts, and we're able to do that because we have a better cash flow. So some of that is just us updating our practices to make sure that we're not kind of bunching a bunch of expenditures in one month and then having very few in the next. All right, so this is our cash flow, and one thing that's new I want to point out, the blue line is where we ended last year. The orange line is our projections for this year, and the new bit is the gray line. So we added this to show you where we actually ended cash-wise, and you'll see it's pretty on par with our projection. Usually those variances are timing differences for when the cash arrives rather than anything being missing or extra. So we're doing very well cash-wise. A lot of that, again, is due to the increase in our state aid. We're also claiming reimbursements for our grant programs more frequently, which is helping us fund those throughout the year on a more consistent basis. All right, the next thing I wanted to talk to you about was our federal stimulus funding. And very first, briefly, I wanted to just touch on how these funds were given to us. So basically, it's 3 phases of funding. The CARES Act was the first, the Carissa Act was the second, and ARP was the third. And the reason I want to highlight that is that the CARES Act just recently ended at the end of this September, so that first phasing of funding is now complete. The Carissa Act will be ending September 30th of 2023, so when we start getting into budget conversations, that's something to keep in your mind, that that second phasing is going to start falling off. And the ARP for the most part, with the exception of the 611 ARP grants and the 619 ARP grants, are going to end in 2024. So we have one more year left of those. And that's part of what we've been talking about as far as sustainability for our budgets going forward. And this is just an overview of what those funds are as far as dollar value. So again, CARES, ESSER, and GEAR are finished. We have closed those out. CARISA will be ending September 30th of 2023. And for all of those ones that start out with ARP, with the exception of the IDEA portions, will end in 2024. The IDEA portions will end in 2023. So overall, we've got about $16 million in federal aid, and we're working diligently to spend that for our taxpayers. So right now, out of the 16 million, we've spent 9.6 million. We have 6.5 million left to spend. You know, again, this is pooled between all of those various funding sources. And we have it split here for you so that you can see in our SCP areas where we're focusing most. You'll notice that instruction is a very large piece of this, as well as innovation and leadership, which I know has been a big part of our conversations in a budgetary aspect as well as for our students and families. So we are working to spend that remaining $6.5 million, but we will keep updating you as we go along. And then lastly here, split again by SCP area, is what we're actually spending the funds on. So as far as changes, we really haven't changed very much from our initial plans. There have been a couple slight adjustments that have been made as far as adding transportation retention and some digital signs for the front of our buildings to get messages out to our community members and families. So we have pretty much stayed on par. We have a lot of investment in instruction, literacy, social emotional developmental health, family engagement. The innovation portion is largely tied to our one-to-one Chromebook initiative, which Dr. Lisi has been helping to implement. And you know, we've also been working, as you know, to update our business office processes and make sure that we're staying current and efficient for our families.
Any questions before we move to the next section?
Just with the IDEA allocations, what was the focus of the additional fund? Is that those were additional funds above what we would have otherwise gotten?
Correct. So we still received our annual allocations of the 611 and 619 for 2022-23. These were amounts above and beyond to be used for the same items that those grants are, you know, used for year to year. So a lot of it is continuing to support practices we already have in place, you know, like TCIS interventions and things like that.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Also, moving forward here, I was asked to respond to a board inquiry regarding our district vehicle fuel purchases, more specifically how we handle sales tax. So first, I kind of want to go through the process with you just so we have an understanding of how that works in the business office. And first and foremost, we provide all of our vendors with our sales tax exempt form. That's kind of our first step in that process. We receive invoices from our vendors, and all of that goes through our standardized process of review. Our fuel purchases are no different. They follow the same oversight and accountability procedure as any other district purchase. In this case, if we receive our fuel purchase invoice, our district transportation supervisor reviews that invoice and makes sure that it aligns with our receipts and anticipated purchases. Once completed, the invoice makes its way to the business office, where it once again is reviewed to ensure policy compliance. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, the board-appointed claims auditor reviews that prior to the invoice being paid. Lastly, if by some chance we inadvertently pay a sales tax in an invoice, we have the ability and the option to apply for a reimbursement from New York State. So there are multiple levels of accountability through that process. As a footnote, over the summer, we did investigate the possibility of purchasing fuel via state contract or other means. And what we determined was that the processes that are already in place for that possibility would imply that we would have to purchase a certain minimum of fuel and also have district tanks, which we don't have. So it wasn't a viable option for us at that time. So at this point, we'll continue to pursue the most cost-effective options, but right now this is the route that we're taking.
And the only agreement we have,
It is the only agreement we have,
well,
correct?
is with a particular business
That's correct.
locally, and our drivers are instructed to go there. They fill up,
That's correct.
they get a receipt.
They do.
The receipt is turned in, as you said, and goes through several checks. So the misinformation that we heard, I just wanted to make sure that it was clear to anyone that might have watched our board meeting, that for whatever reason, there was a misunderstanding about what goes on, and this is actually what happens, and we do not pay sales tax, and we never had an agreement with the city. We were never in a mutual agreement with the city for fuel.
That's correct. And we verified that with the city. We actually contacted them, and
Correct.
nothing was in place. Additionally, I was also asked to respond to a BOE inquiry, Board of Education inquiry, regarding how we purchase food supplies. And there was an instance brought up regarding the purchase of food supplies at a local business. And I think Mrs. Geithner could probably add to this conversation because it actually had to do with our family consumer science class. Would you mind sharing how that works?
So our family and consumer science teachers are afforded some time in their schedule to plan and shop for projects that are timely, the purchase and planning of what they're going to cook in class and the supplies that they might need for that, which many of which are perishable. We space those purchases out as those projects are being addressed within the class, and so they do have time in their schedule for planning and shopping and procuring of those items that they'll need on a day-to-day basis or over the course of a week within a specific unit of baking and cooking.
And as you know, when you purchase wholesale, there's minimum quantities required. So in this case, it made more sense to purchase locally and support our local employers and businesses.
And we can't mix those purchases up with our federal lunch
Correct.
foods. There's a whole accounting process for that, which is separate. And I will just say that a few years ago, the audit committee discussed with Superintendent Polvino our concern that sometimes the purchases weren't made locally. And it's always been, or for many years, as long as I've been here, that's a long time, the policy to, where all things are equal, we try to do business locally with our local businesses. And so that's why someone would likely see a teacher shopping for those items here locally in our community. We just can't do better on the pricing because it's small amounts because it's based on 1 or 2 classes. Am I right, Mrs. Geithner? So it's really not a large amount of food product. And again, storage is an issue, as well as, and we can't just store it. I know people, and that's the misnomer, because we have the federal foods, there's this thought that we can just mix everything, and we really can't do that to be accountable for all the products.
It's on.
Yeah, I don't hear you. Yep, you're on.
I'll tell you what.
Well, I was just going to say we could make some of the purchases or see if we can make some of the purchases through our food service, though, and then do an invoice. You know what I mean? Like, if that is a concern that people are using a card to go to the grocery store. There are options to do that. No.
Yeah, but it comes back to the storage, though. Where are we going to store depending on how much, it gets, yeah.
My understanding is that when the students prepare these menus or these recipes, they're very specific and it's a very small quantity. So in this case, it makes sense because, again, we can't store large quantities of whatever particular item they're ordering. We may never use what they're ordering, in fact. So in this case, it makes sense, certainly, to purchase locally in small amounts.
But we're also not the only school district whose family consumer science classes
go to the store and buy their ingredients. I mean, this is
Absolutely.
not an uncommon practice. Some school districts actually take their students with them
Correct.
when they're
Correct.
doing these shopping trips for their class. So, I mean, we could do it through the food service, but it's really part of that class and so small, and it's not uncommon.
No, it's actually fairly common practice. So, thank you. The last issue, there was an inquiry regarding our elevator at 4th Street. We're well aware Maintenance and Facilities is looking into options for that, and that's something that we're likely going to see that as part of a capital project in all likelihood.
Thank you for the response to those questions.
My pleasure.
Okay. Any other discussion? Thank you, Dr. Lisi. Ms. DiBiase, thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda this evening is the 23-24 budget update. We should be seeing some of the executive budget on February 1st. The executive gets a couple extra weeks after a election year. And so we have February 1st, as opposed to it would have been ready for this meeting normally. But we'll be looking for that week. So what they're projecting is somewhere between the 1st and the 5th or 6th, we should start to see those state aid runs. They generally come out soon after the executive does her presentation. So we're looking forward to those numbers. The preliminary numbers back in November were quite heartening. Would look pretty good. So we'll see. It was looking good at doing the promise for the full funding, but we'll be looking for those numbers to see what that does for us. The other thing I wanted to draw attention to, so we'll do an update on the 14th of February. With respect to that, we should have some initial numbers, and we often do give me idea of what our budget may be looking like in a very general overview to get started with our budget season. Also, small city school districts. I sit on the board of directors. Fulton has a history of being on the board of directors with previous superintendents, as well as probably some board members in the past as well. But we're meeting with assemblymen and senators this week. We've been doing online sessions. We're meeting with the Office of New York State Education Budget. The New York State Budget Office is actually meeting with us on Thursday. So we had a meeting yesterday. We have a meeting, I believe, tomorrow, and I have a meeting on Thursday. So once again, Small Cities is definitely an organization that serves us well. And sitting on that board of directors, I have the opportunity to really interact with some of the higher officials in the state to understand what's going on. And I believe Fulton is very much a part of that. And we're reinforcing the constitutional debt limit. I'm going to be bringing that up with my peers at our next superintendent's meeting. It really doesn't impact smaller school districts at all. It affects small city school districts, and what we need to do is get that word out. So we'll be sharing that information. Also, we're working with a professor at Rutgers University and we are sharing that paper. I believe I shared it with the board on Friday as well, but that paper now has been shared with all of the politicians and the representatives that we're working with, talking specifically about the impacts of a full foundation aid formula that is distributed in a way that provides and supports all of the needs. It should be a needs-driven formula, and that's the formula that, or elements of the formula that we're really trying to reinforce with our politicians.
I guess I would ask that good places for us to get our message out to would be to Oswego County School Boards Association, Central New York School Boards Association that we belong to, as well as a conversation with the city board. And I don't know, David, if you could take the lead on that to talk to the city board, and perhaps they could go back and share with their respective boards. I don't think we can share that message enough to garner the level of support we're going to need from our neighbors to get equity. And that's what we're looking for in small cities. It's an equity issue.
I know that Chris Todd has a very good handle on, things too, as well as with his connections to Albany, and he reports regularly at our meetings.
But I mean, I think there's something about us personally asking, as a small city district in this county, to ask our fellow school board members and school boards to support us in this endeavor so that we can enjoy the same ability to finance projects that they have. I think if the more they hear it, and the more and an opportunity to ask questions so that they understand it, that it's not going to cost them anything. It's just to help us gain that equity, to have the same ability to provide for our students as they do for theirs.
A great example that kind of leads into the second part of this piece here, which was our capital improvement project 2023. So we're meeting this Friday with our architects. We plan on coming to the board on February 14th with a scope of work. They've been actually, we've kind of expedited our building condition survey in a way, because it wasn't due for a year and a half, but we felt we needed to do that to drive the work. So to give you an example, we're looking at right around the $20 million range, which sounds outstanding. However, some of our districts, in the region, similar districts, are double and triple that amount. And that's all related, goes back to what we were just talking about.
With smaller students.
With smaller student bodies. But the bigger issue is this constitutional debt limit. So I believe our debt limit right now is right around 38 million. That's at 5%. Every other district, if you're a central school district, you are double that. You are 10%. So for us, just putting us on the leveling playing field with all other districts in New York State, that would move our constitutional debt, our debt limit ability at 10% to 76 million. So that $20 million project could actually be a 40, 50 million dollar project, similar to some of the districts that are near us that have had those types of projects. You can do a lot of work in a very, in actually a more cost-effective way, because you can do a higher volume at the same time, as opposed to doing small projects here and there, piecemealing it together. And then what happens is you end up cutting those projects down, and you end up doing what you absolutely have to get done, as opposed to being extremely proactive and provide the buildings to support and the projects to support what we need to get done for all of our kids in this district.
And truthfully, we're always doing a project here, and that's why. Small cities are always doing a project. Look around us, our colleagues that have that 10% limit aren't always doing projects. They do them every so many years. It's like non-stops, a little bit here, a little bit there. So again, that equity would be helpful to not just on the money side, trying to save some money, but it would also help us on time, because it takes administrative focus to make sure those projects go well. And we've got other things that I think we'd rather have our administrators doing, but it's a necessary evil, so it has to be done.
So our plan is to give you a scope and sequence February 14th. We have to have a final project to put forward to the community 45 days prior to the budget vote. So we're looking at by the end of April, we have to be locked in for the project that we'd be presenting to our community. So obviously there's a lot of good, a lot of projects. They came, apparently I've seen the tentative list. There's a lot on there. There are districts, and I look forward to the number, but there are districts, I've been reading articles that are talking about they have $150, $180 million worth of work that's being shown that needs to be done based on their building condition surveys. And, small cities tends to have older buildings, things like that. But I will say that I think that this district, and I've only been here for one capital project, that has gone quite well and it's coming to fruition. I think we've done an outstanding job with that. But but prior to that, prioritizing and keeping us rolling, they've done an outstanding job for a number of decades dealing with this problem of having limited ability to do expansive projects. So, more to follow.
And you will let us know what, I'm trying not to yell too loud, but. So you are gonna let us know, based on the building condition survey, what our top priority,
Yep.
essentially.
Yep.
Are we looking at, I know that some of the elementary school playgrounds were brought up a couple months ago. Are
Yep.
those being considered, or
So
do we have any idea?
all on the list. So that actually, I'm glad you brought that. One of the areas that we're actually also pushing for, so the answer to that is yes. We will be sitting on Friday to get a prioritized list. You'll see the entire scope and all the different things,
Gotcha.
and then we'll say, here's where we're at. And then that's obviously what we work on from February into the end of March, and then we tighten her up, going into April, and then we're ready to roll, and then we obviously have to PR and talk about those things. One of the other areas that we're talking to the legislators about is actually the capital outlay projects. Right now, the limit in New York State is $100,000. So if you're familiar with the Fairgrave project that we did, that was a capital outlay project a couple of years ago. And with that, we still supplemented it a little bit to provide the playground that we have there now. But what we're advocating for is either a 250,000 or a 500,000 capital outlay project. And I will tell you, every school district in the state would want to be doing that, because 100,000 sounds like a lot, but it's very limiting what you can do. So that's where I'd like to see those projects go, would be in one-year outlays, utilizing some of our reserves, you know, and some of our general fund balances right now. Based on the numbers we're seeing, that would be the best way. And if you do that within the year, you get all of that reimbursement in the same year. So it's really it's a very aggressive way to get some projects done for our kids. We have improved over at Lanigan. We added the swings, some things over there when we did the work. And so right now we haven't done really a lot of work at Volney in particular. Fairgrave has a new lot, and Granby was actually done not too long before I came to the district, so somewhere in the 10 to 15 year range.
You hit the nail.
as well.
Volney needs some attention.
Oh, I
Just
know
some
where it is.
inclusion stuff too, because there's not anything
Yep.
there. But then, so one more question on the building condition survey. So just for clarification, someone comes around, basically walks through all of our buildings, looks at every nook and cranny, basically, right?
Yep.
Okay, and
So
then
what
provides
happened-
a report for us that,
So ours is a
That-
little expedited and a little different, because we had till 2024, I think, to do it. But because of our debt limit and in the budget, we need to keep a certain amount of debt on the budget, which doesn't make sense. We'll talk more about that down the road. But because we have a project coming off, we can't afford not to make sure that we're doing a project, because it could affect our budgets significantly. So that's a piece of this. And so we want to make sure we're doing that as well. But yes, our architects walk through, and in fact, our chief of operations, as well as our director of facilities, Mr. Crump, actually, we did a little something different this time. He actually sat with all of our head custodians and our head maintenance people, and they actually sat down and brainstormed a list of priorities at every single one of our schools, which was then our architects sat down with him. They went through those lists, so they've actually incorporated the feedback from the on the ground, you know, people that have been working, and we've been blessed. We have a maintenance crew that's been here a long time, so they know where some of our major issues are that you don't see by walking into a room, but there might be something going on right below us that's extremely important. So a little different approach. I thought it was, and I think it's, you know, the timing was just perfect. I thought it was a good process. I don't know if you'd add anything to that, Dom, but that kind of overviews what we did.
There were other items left over from our previous
Yeah.
capital project that we have to add to that list as well, that were priorities then and remain priorities.
Yep, and there's other things, you know, that elevator that came up. There's some things that we have to look at as well. But it's exciting. You know, you get a little excited. $20 million is I think, around the ballpark. We'll be able to give you better figures here in the near future. And then, more importantly, a listing and get an idea of kind of what are those priorities of the priorities that we have right now. And then you heard me trying to get some other irons in the fire with respect to the capital outlay and advocating for that as well.
So the one piece I didn't hear that I know concerns most of our taxpayers is when you plan these and you bring these forward, it's done in a way that we know it's not going to have an impact on that tax bill, because we keep that debt rolling along at an even level. So we wait to do things until we have a certain amount of free from debt, and then we can go ahead and do some more. So it's incur the debt, do the work, pay debt off, do some more.
Yep.
Not terribly unlike how probably most of us manage at home.
Exactly. And with a small city with that debt limit, we have to manage a little different. We have to do a lot more small projects than a large project every a larger number of years, because you could spread that debt out longer. But more importantly, they can do more work at the same time, where we have to say, okay, what can we do now? What's available now? And we just keep coming with our projects. And obviously, I've mentioned before, we'll be talking about reserves and things like that as well, which probably should be driven towards capital project types of things as well, but that'll be in future meetings.
But you typically review all of that. Will be reviewed with the board what
Oh,
the
yeah.
list is, and everybody. So we'll get a chance to say, wait a minute, where's such and such?
Yeah, we're laying the groundwork for a number of future meetings. Budgets always can be an exciting season. It's our next best opportunity to support the needs of our kids.
Yeah,
So-
you should have a chance for your voice, and if you don't think it's happening, just ask and make sure that it happens.
And then finally, our budget committee, I anticipate having that first one on the 7th. And it'll be that same kind of, let's brainstorm, what are the things that you're hearing, things that you'd like to see. So it's really, it provides us a great opportunity to do that.
I have something.
You do.
Let's start off right out of the gate tonight. So we saw this nice little presentation on all of our federal grants. I'm wondering if you can provide the board with an update as to what items under those grants that are gone, that we're finished with, what were they supporting? And are we able to, are there plans to want to move it into the general budget or not, so that we can kind of brace ourselves for what that may look like? Or were they one-shot purchases that were done? We purchased and we're done and we're not gonna do it again.
Yeah, so I knew that was the question you were going to ask. That was
Well,
pretty
you
good. We've
know
worked
me.
long
It's good
enough.
that
I
you
know
know
what the
me.
board's
There
going to ask me. The answer to that is as it was in the spring when we worked last year. If you remember, last year we moved 3 of the positions right off of the funded monies and into the general budget. We'll be doing the same thing this time, really looking at what are those areas where we're definitely seeing that impact already, and we're like, this is something we got to carry on. An example might be, well, I'll give you an example we already did, the nurse position, the ELL position, I believe was the one, and what was the third one? And the counselor, 6th grade counselor positions, 2 of those positions being mandated services that we have to provide, where we were always a bit in a weaker area. So those were 2 of the areas. We'll look at the same in the areas of literacy, in the areas of safety and security. That's an area where we've had more conversation around our SPOs, things like that. So obviously, those are pieces that weren't necessarily part of that,
Right.
but we've been able to carry, and we've been looking at expansion of
And
those as well.
the reason I ask is because there's always a little bit of sticker shock, because we get it, we look at it, we like, okay, but there was monies to do that extra stuff, and now we've got to decide, what are we keeping, what can we afford to keep, and then, you know, maybe we get down to hard choices. I don't know if we're going to have to make hard choices based on, we don't know what the governor's budget is yet. It may not be as difficult, but it could be difficult. So
Yeah.
I just want to be prepared.
You know, and I think the thing that's always important is this year, as Ms. DiBiase talked about, and Dr. Lisi, we still have funds. You know, we're still looking at ARP funds through 24. We're looking at, you know, we should be fully funded based on the current formula.
Right.
If things move forward like they're supposed to.
Right.
And perhaps a little bit more, because last year they were a little bit more than where they were. The big question will be, is it 24 or 25? 25, 26. That's the year where we're really thinking, as we're budgeting now, we need to be thinking about 2 to 3 years from now, and there's some unknowns there, especially that foundation aid formula as well. So
Yep.
again, those are the kinds of things. So we want to be conservative at the same time. We want to push it far enough where we can maximize and the dollars and the resources that we have available, so we ensure that we're meeting our kids' needs. And, you know, this evening we heard a lot about, you know, our restorative practices and all of those pieces. You know, our kids are more complex across the country right now with the needs that they're presenting. We're not unique in the Fulton City School District. And I think that's something, you know, to think about. Kids, you know, things have changed for them. Their experience over the last 3 to 5 years has changed, and the world is changing, and you watch the news and you hear the reports and you see things like that. Our kids are experiencing all of that, and they're bringing different needs to the tables, and our teachers and our staff on the front lines doing an outstanding job dealing with some combinations of issues that perhaps were in the past more unique, and we're seeing a higher volume of things. So I think the area you heard about tonight is one of those areas that's essential for us to build that culture and build that climate. And now we've got the instructional pieces, the safety and security pieces. All of that together creates who we are as a district. So,
Well, thank you.
you're welcome. Any other questions about budget? You can tell it's coming up. I'm getting excited, right?
Brian,
Probably not as yep, Tim.
do we have a first meeting scheduled in yet to really discuss what those priorities are going to be in line with our coherence plan, regardless of the funding we get? Just so, you know, off the bat, we realize, you know, wherever the chips may fall, you know, here's where we're going first. Of course, it's always what we are mandated to do, but then when it comes to the extras, making sure we're falling in line with what we're, you know, not necessarily our opinion as the board, but what we as a district have decided and laid out that we are going to prioritize.
Yep. So we had our meeting back in December with some pieces, aligning some pieces. And then what we'll do is at the February 14th meeting, the February 28th meeting, and then March 7th is either going to be a budget workshop for the board or a committee meeting, and we can always schedule another one. The board can always schedule another. I think what we have to do is get the initial numbers, Tim, and then what we'll do is we'll sit with the board and we'll decide what do we need, what are the recommendations that we're making as far as, I think one of the big questions, as Robin asked, is what needs to come over into the general fund. I'm not seeing, we know there's going to be an increase in revenues. We just don't know if it's going to be the full allocation that that we've been promised that we're supposed to get. So we'll see in a couple of weeks. And then what I would say, Tim, is at the pleasure of the board, we can then start looking at all the pieces of the budget. And then if we need more work outside of these board meetings, we can hold budget meetings for the entire board, or budget workshop meetings as well, to make the priorities match up. Did that answer your question or not? Did I talk too much?
So are you saying that the budget, when we're talking through that, it's going to be aligned with our board meetings on the Tuesdays, or are they going to be the opposite alternative?
Yeah, so we always have a strong focus from, we're actually one meeting later because the budget from the executive didn't come out. It would have been this one normally, would have been our kind of kickoff. We normally do a roll forward budget kind of at our first meeting in February, and that kicks off our budget season to see all of those components, and then we work from there to see, one, where are we at revenues and expenditure wise, and then we determine the next steps. In some years we've had multiple budget workshops, in other years we've been able to do most of the work at our general normal sessions with one or two. It really depends as things start to evolve.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on the budget? All right, so a couple weeks we should have some numbers. And then finally, our FCSD logo and name, I just want to let the board know, we had just a great meeting last night. I can't say it, and Dom and Dr. Lisi and Ms. Geithner were there as well last evening. We had, I believe, 20 people there. We had, I believe, 6 students. We had community members, parents, teachers. All of our stakeholder groups were represented. We just had a great meeting. It flowed well. We had some great conversation. Questions that we did last night, just as I quickly take a look here. We started off by having them share, they introduced themselves, they just share one word to describe a quality that you personally believe that every FCSD student must have or demonstrate to be successful every day, now and in the future. And then after we generated some pretty powerful words, which was pretty great, we then said, this is what our branding and our logo should represent. It should bring that together, K-12. It was a great way to kick it off. It couldn't have gone much better than that. And so I have the listing of words. What we'll be doing, we'll be putting all the information. There'll be a web page. It'll have the minutes of the meetings. We actually use the PowerPoint that we use. We've embedded the minutes right into it so they can actually see. It's right there. The members are in there as well. We're going to have a Let's Talk button there, which will be specific if anybody could just click that button and put their question, their thought, their idea right in there. It comes directly to us, and we're sharing all that information. We aligned and talked about how the words we generated aligned with our mission and our vision as a district. We talked about the charge of the committee, with the goal being that we're going to be recommending 3 recommendations for a new name, logo, branding at one of our May 2023 board meetings, as that's our goal working forward. So there's a lot of work to be done prior to that. We also, we talked about other ways to communicate. So we generated a whole list, and you'll see those. I'm not going to read those, but we talked about many different ways to get information out and collect information. Kiosks, videos, apps, you name it. We had all sorts of things on there. And then we also brainstormed an initial list, which we'll come back to. We have a February 13th meeting is our next meeting, and we did what information does the advisory committee want to collect to inform recommendations. We have a whole listing in the minutes here. And then we talked about what methods will be utilized to gather that information. So we had a really rich hour and a half meeting. It was a lot of good information to start off with, and then we'll build on that at our next meeting in February. This was an in-person meeting at the junior high.
Mr. Palvino, I just want to share that online, the Let's Talk link is now active for the logo and branding. So on our website, it's right at the top there, you'll see Let's Talk. If you scroll down at the bottom, there's a button there that says FCSD logo and branding, so that is live and ready to use.
What's that do, Dom?
So it would send a, you can use that link to send us a message so that it'll go directly to Mrs. Perry and Mr. Palomino.
Okay, so basically anyone who has a comment just sends it through there?
Correct.
I just wanted to clarify
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Thank you.
And right now on our, we haven't really, we soft rolled it out, but we do have Let's Talk on the front page, been on our front page since September. And we get about 3 to 5 questions a week from, how do I get a transcript, to I have a question about transportation, or I have a question about this, and it comes directly in, and then we respond. Our goal is to respond to those within 24 hours. And we always send an acknowledgement, thank you for, so they know that a person has received it at minimum. And that's the conclusion of the superintendent's report.
Thank you.
Look forward to future reports. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me? All right. Item 4.01, to accept the financial reports. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. Item 4.02, to accept operations and finance report for December of 2022. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, and abstentions. Item 4.03, disposal of surplus property.
Move it.
Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. Excuse me. Jeepers. Item 4.04, accept the audit results.
Move it.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. Item 4.05, to accept the corrective action plan for the extra classroom audit.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. Item 4.06, to accept the single audit report. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. Item 5.01, to approve the Committee on Special Education recommendations.
Move it.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. First reading of policies. Are there any comments, questions? It was. I'm not hearing any questions or comments. All right, we're going to move on. Next meeting, we'll have the policy to accept excuse me, not the policy. We will have this on to accept these policies. I'm wondering if you would like to batch the personnel items 7.01 through 7.09.
Move it.
Second.
Any discussion on any of those items?
There's no JV boys lacrosse coach listed? I don't know who it is. Oh, Mr. Nellis is here.
I noticed it. I mean, I normally don't ask. Will we be bringing your name forward? Yes. At the next meeting? Hopefully. Okay.
And second, modified track coach, is that for boys and girls?
Correct. That should be an assistant, right?
It just says
Oh, correct.
Coach Killian, modified track, so boys and girls, should that be more money? Since it's both?
So there should be 2 coaches there.
Yes, it was.
It was on, now it's off.
Yep.
Now it's on.
So there should be 2 coaches
Gotta get
there.
close.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
He's up above and then she's, okay, so one is boys and one is girls?
So the way we structure our track program, because they practice at the same time and go to the meets at the same time, we didn't really designate a boys and girls coach.
Gotcha.
But
Okay.
they kind of share the responsibilities,
All right.
and there's going to be an assistant coach coming forward
For modified?
for modified. We've always had 3 coaches there.
Okay, that's it.
Okay. Is there any other discussion or questions? All those in favor? Opposed, and abstentions. Passed 600. This brings us to board forum, and Mr. Cordone, would you like to start?
Sure, just wanted to thank the superintendent and his team for the reports this evening. I thought they were all very informative. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you. Mrs. Mainville?
Are we doing the thank yous and all of that?
Board forum,
Sorry,
yep.
I was talking side talk. Teachers
all
are the
right.
worst. Thank you, Reverend Warner. I love your energy, your positivity, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at community events. It was really great meeting you tonight. And that's it. That's all I have.
Mrs. Papalardo?
Yep, I just want to say thank you and welcome, and we appreciate you. Nice job with numbers, presentation, and that's it.
Mrs. Abelgore?
Thank you for the presentations, the clarifications on some of the restorative practice issues. I thank you so much for joining us, Reverend. It was very nice to have you here. I just wanted to make one correction to the last meeting we had. In my statement for the SRO, National SRO Day, I did also thank Mr. Sheldon, and I see that it only says that I was thanking Mr. Jones. I think both gentlemen do a wonderful job in our district, and I just wanted to make sure that they're both appreciated. They know that they're appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Connors?
On top of what everyone's already said, I'd just like to specifically thank Ms. Tiffany again. I think what we do from the social emotional learning is so crucial to today. Really only 30% of how we do in competency in our job is IQ. 70% left over, a lot of that comes from emotional. That's not saying 70% is emotional, but making sure we prepare our students to go out into the world to emotionally be able to regulate, handle themselves, and problem solve are such important skills. And I think it's so great that we're putting so much time and that we have someone so passionate about it with Ms. Tiffany. So thank you again.
Well said, Mr. Connors. And I appreciate all the reports. I appreciate all the work that everyone does every day to make our district work well for our students and their families. That to me is more important than where we stand on a list somewhere or not. It's the dedication to our students and families. That moves me greatly. People wonder how that's the stuff that makes me tick and makes me excited and happy and sad when we don't work well. But we are working pretty well on a lot of different things, so thanks for that. I too am excited, Reverend, that you came. It's really nice. Not everyone will take the time to come and introduce them, especially someone new to the community. So that's rather outstanding. That
Believe it or not, it's totally out of my comfort zone.
Wow, I don't believe it.
Super happy to be here.
Well, you made it look very easy, so it's hard to believe it's out of your comfort zone.
Daddy's working on doing that one, believe me.
Wow. Well, I wouldn't have guessed that, so that's wonderful. And again, we have a lot of work ahead of us, as the board always does, and I very much appreciate all the planning that goes into what has to happen in order to have another great school year. And I'm sure we'll get it done. So with that said, that brings us to the second public forum. Now, the second public forum is, if there's any questions you have on a topic that was on tonight's agenda, now's the moment where you could ask us if you have a question about tonight's meeting. But it's just about tonight's meeting. Going once, twice. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not understanding, should I go, I'm good from here? I don't understand what policies, first reading of policies meant.
Okay, so we are a policy-driven district, and we have a policy committee that's made up of our stakeholders here in Fulton. And all of these policies, you can actually find them online if you go to our district website. You can find our policies, and you can read every one of them if you are so moved to want to do that. And what this board does is take the recommendations from the policy committee. We receive it in backup if they recommend changes or not, any changes to the policy. And then this board has this meeting to discuss anything on those policy recommendations. And next meeting, we will vote to continue those policies, or sometimes we discontinue policies. So, again, it represents who our community is, and it provides a roadmap, if you will, for all of our folks here in the Fulton School District. As long as they make decisions within the framework of the policies, they're good to go, and we need to be supporting them. All right. You're welcome. Did I do okay with that? All right. Okay. And that's it for now. So we're now going to go to item 8.03. This board needs to go into an executive session. And we have a single item to discuss. I'm not expecting to be there very long. But when we come back from executive session, we will come together to close this meeting. So before we go, I'd like to thank anyone that may be watching tonight's meeting. Again, this board appreciates those who take the time to join us, whether it's through live stream or in person. We also appreciate those people who just check in through our live stream as to what's happening in our district. So I will ask now for someone to move item 8.03.
Move it.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed and abstentions. Passed 6-0-0. And after a 5-minute break, we're going to go into executive session and take care of this piece of business. Thank you all. Have our jackets on. You want me to tell everybody we're freezing?
It is freezing in
Because we're
here.
saving money, we're freezing.
That's right.
Wow,
saving
okay.
money.
Tim? We're ready, so I have before me item 9.01 to adjourn this meeting.
Move it. Second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed and abstentions, pass 600. Go get warm, everybody.